Doc Ryan, Expedition 44. We are talking about hermeneutics, and we did a version on translations, and we had a few people ask some questions, and everybody always wants to know what's the best translation, and that's so loaded. You hear a lot of people say, I want the most literal translation. I want to know exactly what the text says. This is almost impossible to do. We're 3 or 4 films into this, and I think you're starting to understand that if you're tracking with all of them. But there's kind of a line that you follow when you're getting into translations. So some translations are going to try to be as literal word for word as they possibly can. And translations like this might be the NASB is known for this, or the ESV could be there. Some people would even say the King James Version does a pretty good job with this, but is that really the best? That's the question. And so when you want to look at what is literal, the best way to do that is actually just go and find a good interlinear, and an interlinear is going to show you the Greek or Hebrew and then the exact words underneath them. But when you try to read the exact Hebrew words as they are translated into an English word, it doesn't really read. You're going to go through it and go, this doesn't make really any sense. And so the role of the translators are to figure out what it best says in the language that they're translating it into, which in our case is English. And there's so much that goes into this translation process that is really tough. And so a few of these things is that we really lack a lot of original manuscripts. You hear that term thrown around a lot, and when you look at what do we really have, we don't even really know if we have the original manuscripts, particularly when you start talking about Old Testament Hebrew. They just don't exist. We don't have them. So then you go back and you say, well, let's look at the early copies of what we do have. Do they agree? Do they say the same thing? And then you kind of start getting into, there's notations throughout those, or should those notations be included in the original Bible or not? So Acts 8:37 is kind of the most popular one of those, where, you have it written, then off to the side you have what some people say is the gospel message over here, and should that be part of the Bible or not? And different translations treat it a little bit different. But a lot of people like to look at this as this ominous thing of, are you adding to the Bible or taking away the Bible? And when you really look at it, that's not really what it is. It's just, most of these early versions of it, we kind of have that notation there. So should it be included or not? I mean, it's really not as crazy as people think to include it or not include it. And in my findings, in the 3 major times that we see it, it's not necessarily taking away or adding to it. It kind of already says the same thing, so I don't see that as a major issue, but it's a fun study at the same time. Now next, I've kind of said this before, if you don't understand English very well, if you struggled in 9th grade English class, you're really going to struggle when you start getting into the real speech of Greek and Hebrew, particularly Greek. And so there's so many different parts of speech, and I'm real big on the socio-rhetorical view that you have to understand how this was written within its culture before you can even begin to translate that back into how we would interpret or understand that within our own cultural Western English language dynamic. And so just to give you an idea of this, the Bible is written very beautifully. In fact, I love the Old Testament because some of them are just the greatest literary works. And there's so many different things that just get into amazing figurative forms of writing. You have metaphors and simile and personification and hyperboles and euphemisms. And then you get into puns and then maybe even idioms. And they are all going to carry their own complexities that sometimes we can't even understand how it was written in its culture before we can understand how that would translate. And so when you get back into that, what is the most literal? Well, if you're translating it word for word, it might not make any sense. But then when you take the meaning or maybe the thought pattern and you translate it into a more modern language that we're seeking to read it in, such as English, it might make more sense. There might even be some times where it just doesn't really carry over, so perhaps a paraphrase is even better. And that's what linguists are looking at when they're trying to figure out the challenge of interpreting Scripture. All right, so within translations, there's a little bit of a spectrum. Now, I've mentioned a little bit of this already, but on the front end of the spectrum, you have a word-for-word translation, and that would be like interlinear words, the kind of exact words, but we're going to put them into English and let people figure out exactly what that meant. And that's a form equivalence within hermeneutics. Now the next step is meaning for meaning, and that's a natural equivalence. And so when you take meaning for meaning, you're going to try to say, what did this mean in the original text that it was written in, and would that slightly change in English, but what would the closest meaning be? And then you kind of have thought for thought, and a lot of times the meaning for meaning and thought for thought, those two functions kind of go into each other, so it's kind of a natural equivalence type of thing where they blend in. But that idea is, what was the thought, very similar, of the old, and what would be the thought of the new? And then you have a paraphrase, and a paraphrase would say, okay, what did that mean? Now, what's the best or the better way to say it in English? And we all kind of have the Good News Bible. That's what we know of a paraphrase, but there's all kinds of paraphrase Bibles out there, and some of them are actually more textually accurate than the more literal ones. And so when people give different translations a hard time, I just kind of laugh, or when they say, tell me, I want to know the most literal thing, it's kind of a sore spot for me because it's so much more complex than that. And so usually when you see the different forms of translation, I particularly like the NASB because it's a pretty literal translation of those words, and even though a lot of times it might not make a lot of sense, we don't really get the best translation because there's all of these different types of forms of speech and figurative uses within the language that we might not carry over. It gives me a great base to climb from. Now, some Bibles have even tried to mix all those things together and just get the best meaning per every part of the Bible. And so my new favorite in that is the Kingdom New Testament. That's N.T. Wright's latest work of translation of the New Testament. And what he has kind of done is, within his theology, he's gone through and he's taken the New Testament and he's going to use all four of those methods that I kind of did to come up with the way that he thinks they work best with each other theologically. And I think he's done a really good job with it. I fall in line with Wright pretty close theologically in most places, and so I read what he's done, and he's kind of taken all these things into effect and kind of packaged them up into a nice, fine book. And it reads really well from my perspective and comes off in our English language probably closest to this day of what the original reader socio-rhetorically might have understood the scripture to actually say and be. So as you can imagine, when you're looking at figurative speech through the Bible, there's a lot of question marks, and translators have spent a lot of time kind of milling through this, and honestly, most of them agree. It's very rare that you get to one that people don't agree on, but I'll just give you some examples. So an idiom is probably the most complex. That's what I'm going to spend more time on because I think the rest kind of explain themselves. But when you look at an idiom, it's going to be a group of words that if you just took the individual set of words, they don't really make sense, but together it kind of means something. So in our English language, we use a lot of these idioms in day-to-day talk that we got from the Bible. And every time I hear somebody say this, you'll hear me make a joke of, oh, now you're quoting scripture, and people look at me kind of funny, but I just love these. So let's take a look at some of them. One of them is from Isaiah 40, and that's the drop in the bucket. You hear people say this all the time, and that's where it came from. Another one is the apple of one's eye. That's Psalm 17. And you see these all over the place. Adam's apple, Genesis 3, the first stone, let him who has not sinned cast the first stone from John 8, by the skin of your teeth, Job 19, taking someone under your wings, Psalm 17, Psalm 61, Psalm 91, the writing on the wall, that's Daniel 5, when something's set in stone, that comes from Exodus 31, and then you have the whole idea of the Good Samaritan, and we use those terms in English all the time, that's calling somebody a Good Samaritan for the action that they do. And so We see these over and over, extending an olive branch. That goes back to Genesis 8, missing the mark. That's kind of a play on the meaning of the Greek word hamartia, which is Luke 1 and John 1 and 1 John 3. So I could keep going with these. There's a whole bunch. In fact, I don't know that there's any kind of count within the Bible of how many of these there are. They're just all over the place. And they can get pretty complex when you're trying to read the Bible word for word, and it's one of these idioms that we don't commonly use. And you'll hear translators often say, do you think that could have been an idiom? That they said something that might not necessarily make sense in our English translation, and they're trying to figure it out. And so then you go to intertextuality, and you're looking up through other things that were said throughout the area and going, can we find this anywhere outside the Bible? And if so, what did it mean there? So when we have these idioms that we understand in English, that makes it easy. But what happens when there's idioms in the cultural language that we don't have in English? So I don't want to get too into this because I think you're understanding, but let's just take one quick example. Let's look at Luke 1:33. It says, he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever. That's eistus ionis, into the age. Now, it's the literal translation, but is that really what it means? Well, it just simply means forever. And this is one that not too many people would argue or get hung up on or something like that. But to interpret something more into it is not really a good hermeneutic. So that's where part of this you just have to try to understand by looking at what else was in the culture, what it means in other places in the Bible, and derive that perhaps it's an idiom or a different form or figurative part or function of speech, and what is the best understanding that that brings to the table. Another one is sometimes people think that there's idioms in the Bible that no longer culturally carry over. And so one that we see that with is the understanding of men, anthropoi or andres, used 560 times and 214 times. And, are we translating that to be men every time, specifically man, or should that be a little more openly translated? And we don't have time to get into that here, but it's a big debate. So you can see how something like a simple little idiom or form of speech has huge ramifications hermeneutically on your theology and what you might think or the context that it fits within the entire lens of Scripture. So we kind of get back to where we started. What is the best translation? How do you hermeneutically figure out where you stand with something? And we go back to those basic laws. It all has to fit together. It all has to agree. And every scholar, every Bible translator, they're all trying to figure this out for themselves. And I mentioned N.T. Wright's latest translation of the New Testament because it's a good look at somebody that really knows the Bible well, that they've interpreted all of Scripture using these methods that we've been talking about to make it fit together. And it's pretty impressive when you go through each one of these kind of complex situations that we've mentioned, parts of speech, thoughts, meaning for meaning, paraphrases, what works best, and you kind of study each situation and you see the ways that the different translations have handled those things, and usually gives merit to what the original authors were trying to convey best to us. And to be quite honest, there's not a lot of new studies in this area. It's very rare, if ever, that somebody says, oh, now we understand what that meant. For the most part, we agree on the vast majority of these types of figures of speech hermeneutically. They all kind of fit within each other, but eventually, or consistently, I should say, you might see people sometimes doing a little bit of gymnastics to try to make it fit within their theology. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. So I hope that's helped kind of understand some of the complexities that have gone into hermeneutics in understanding the parts of speech, and more so the figurative areas that can be complex and hard to understand. May God bless you and keep you.